My name is Ellie Anbinder. I'm the chair of the LIZKOR committee at Temple Bethlehem. And I want to welcome everybody here. We're very glad to see you all. 3 years ago, we started a program at Temple Bethlehem called LIZKOR, which in Hebrew means to remember. We wanted stories about the Holocaust to be presented to the kids and by the very people who lived them. Our mission was to record these stories. We especially wanted to hear from our TBA members who had survived the death camps, but we also wanted to hear from siblings of survivors and children of survivors, from the soldiers who were POWs, and from those whose history of their family was lost. We have heard many stories of survival and many stories that would fit into the category of miracles. We felt privileged to be able to hear and record these stories. Tonight, as we start our 4th year of this program, we are asking for more stories from the Metro West area. I would like very much to know if you would come to me and tell me if you have a family story or some kind of history that we can have as a presentation recorded and put into our ever-growing LIZKOR library. We are also very interested in any memorabilia that a family may have that could be displayed, as all of these memories of family stories will be on display in 2025 in an exhibit, hopefully right in this hall we're in. Did you hear that, committee? 2025. Tonight, we are very excited to present a story that was, as I understand it, 80 years in the making. It's a story about 2 families and a legacy not known, and will be told to us by one of those family members. To set the stage for this presentation, I'd like to ask Sue Clark, who introduced us at Temple Bethlehem to the story, to speak of her own family history as the first link to our presentation. Sue?
Thank you, Ellie. Welcome, everybody. Well, rewind to 1954. A cousin of my mom's became a house painter after being released from a concentration camp and emigrating from Germany to Washington Heights, New York. He told my parents he had friends who just bought a house in Bergenfield, New Jersey. The builder was Jewish, and the same model was being built across the street. My parents were ready to move out of the city to the burbs, so they went to see the house. I was 3, Barry was 2, his sister was 5. I liked the house so much I locked myself in a closet. His mother always reminded me of that. That was 74 Highview Avenue. My parents bought the house at 59 Highview Avenue, December of 1954. We all became family. As a matter of fact, Barry's mom fixed me up with my first husband, so for a while we were related by marriage. And now both sets of parents are together at Cedar Park Cemetery in Paramus, New Jersey. It doesn't get much closer than this. Barry went to BU and never left the area. He started his own carpet cleaning business and named it after his parents' plumbing business, Amco. Our son now works with him. That's 4 generations. And now at Schechter, our grandson and their next generation granddaughter are in the same class. That's 5 generations of these 2 families being very, very tightly connected. Fast forward to 2021, and I will now turn it over to Uncle Barry, as he's known in my family, Barry Lichtenstein. Enjoy the presentation.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Barry Lichtenstein, and as Sue said, We grew up together in New Jersey. This is really a story about discovery for our family and finding out who we were and where we came from. As she said, I'm the child of Holocaust survivors. It was not really talked about a lot as far as specifics. We heard stories about my mother growing up, and we knew that she had a grandfather who lived in Koblenz that she saw all the time, whose name was Alexander Feiner. And we really didn't know a lot about her family. We didn't know a lot about the background or any other relatives because everybody except one brother was wiped out in the war. So nobody made it except my mother. She was the only survivor from that side of the family. My father's family, he actually came to the States with his mother, two siblings, and a grandfather, but he passed away when I was 7. His sister passed away when I was 5. His brother moved to California, so we didn't have a lot of stories from them, and my grandmother never talked about anything. So we really didn't know family history until 2021, when in June of 2021, there was a phone call from this guy out in California to my younger child who lives out in Oakland. And he said, hi, we're not related, but I have a genealogist doing work for me in Germany. And he asked me if I could try to find you because he knows that you live in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I'm reaching out. We're not related, but if you can contact him, he has information for you. So naturally, she called me up and said, something's going on. And you immediately think internet scam, so something's going on. So she emailed this genealogist in Koblenz. And as it turns out, he had information for us regarding a side of the family that we had no idea about it. And the story is the good dishes is what they were called in Germany. The cast of characters is Siegmund and Thekla Feiner were the people who owned the china, and the china is sitting on the stage. That's that's one of the place settings and one of the servings pieces. Eberhard and Susanna Marx were the people who held the china. Alexander Feiner was Sigmund's brother and my mother's grandfather. My mother, Irene Wolf Lichtenstein Wolf, was the granddaughter of Alexander Feiner. I'm the son of Irene. Elise is my daughter. Ulrika Moritz is the granddaughter of the Marxes, and she was the person who actually had the china. Ron Friedman is the person who contacted us. Dr. Offerhaus is the genealogist who found us. Chris Stoffel was on the Committee of Social Affairs and Culture in the town of Lehman, where the Marxes and the Feiners lived. Arnold Loxler was the Burgermeister of Lehman, which is a big deal if you're in Lehman. The whole town of Lehman is probably the size of Knobscot if you condense it. Bruno Nonninger was a journalist from so in Germany, the TV and radio stations are state-run. They're not private stations. And he's a journalist from he's a radio journalist, print journalist, TV journalist, and podcaster. And he stayed with us like the entire week we were there. And then Walter Karbach, Doris Sporman, and Rudolf Schaefer are all historians writing histories of Jews in that area. So when we got the phone call in the summer of 2021, this is the article that started it out. What happened was this woman who has these dishes, Ulrika Moritz, goes to a farmer's market and meets a wine salesman. And they start talking. And she asks where his shop is. And he says, oh, I have a shop in Lehman. And she goes, Lehman? Interesting story. My grandparents were from Lehman, and I have china in my house that we've been holding for a Jewish family since 1942, when they got relocated and nobody ever came back. And we've been looking for their relatives since 1942, but have been unable to find anybody. And he goes, oh, you should call Chris Stoffel. Chris Stoffel was the head of culture for the town of Lehman. Again, Lehman is tiny little town, maybe a couple of thousand people. And they're working now, this was in summer of 21, on putting together a celebration and commemoration of Jewish culture and history in the country of Germany, which lasted for 1,500 years and ended on November 8th, 1938, or 1939, Kristallnacht, basically. And that's so she calls him. She tells him that she has this china. And he goes, oh, that's an interesting story. Can I send a reporter over to take a picture and tell the story of the china? She goes, sure. So this is the story that's printed in the paper. Now, the paper is similar to, like, if you remember, like the Tab newspaper, it's like that size newspaper. And so imagine you have the Framingham Natick edition of the Tab, and this is the story in it. And then in Worcester is a genealogist who happens to see that story. And he goes, 80 years. I can find these people, because that's what he does. He's an 80-year-old retired Presbyterian minister who does Jewish genealogy. So he found the article. This is Eberhard and Susanna Marx of Lehman. They are Ulrika Moritz's grandparents. He was a teacher, and they lived in this town, and he was not particularly thrilled with the teachings of the Nazi regime, shall we say. So when kids were no longer allowed to go to school, he actually taught the Jewish kids at night in his house, which was a fairly serious offense. And then in the article, in his searchings, because he's a genealogist and he knows what to look for, he went online and started hunting for Feiner information from the town of Lehman. And what he came across was this picture, because 12 years before that, our other child, Elise, the person who got contacted, had been on a trip called One by One. One by One is also an interesting concept. It's the second and third generation Holocaust survivors. So kids and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors spend a week in a retreat in Berlin with the kids and grandchildren of the Nazi perpetrators. Very interesting week. And Elise blogged that week. She was with another girl from Framingham on the same trip, and she blogged that trip. In the blog, she had a picture of this, which is the Wolf Feiner wedding in the town of Coburn in 1921. Coburn is the town next to Lehman. Also, Offer House is in Koblenz, and Koblenz is like the nearest large city. Like I said, it would be like Worcester to Framingham. And there was a relatively large Jewish community and a large Jewish cemetery in Koblenz, and there were Feiners buried in the cemetery. So he already had knowledge of the name. So it helped him find this picture. And that's actually my grandparents' wedding, my mother's parents' wedding. That was 1921. After the war, this was my parents' wedding. This was 26 years later, this was everybody from the Wolf and Lichtenstein families that survived the war. So you saw the 70 or so people that were at the Feiner wedding, and you can imagine at the Lichtenstein wedding, 50, 20 years before, there was a similar amount. This was all the people that survived the war. This is the town of Lehman. As you can see, it's the Moselle River, 3 streets, and then a mountain. It's all vineyards. It's actually beautiful. My mother used to say, Germany, beautiful country. People, not so nice. It's like, and that's what we grew up with. And I got to tell, and I can see it, but the people, this is Christoph Stoffel with our daughter Elise and her husband Corey. And this is Elise with Ulrika Moritz. So this was our first day in Lehman. Now, Elise and Corey actually went a week before us. In that week, they went to various places. Let me backtrack a little bit. When we finally got contact with Chris and Ulrika and everybody, and we realized it was not a scam, because we figured, oh, they have this China, but how much is it going to cost us to get it? And they were like, no. I mean, we'll ship it to you if you want, but if you come here, we will take you anywhere you want to go, show you anything you want to see, and we'll pay for, if you get here, we'll pay for everything. So you just have to get here. And then we will transfer the china in a ceremony in your mother's hometown. So we were like, oh, we could probably do that. So we ended up going. It was myself, my wife, Elise, our other child, Charlie, Elise's husband, and my sister. So there were 7 of us. And they literally, anything we wanted to see, anywhere we wanted to go for the week. Elise and Corey went to several days before us. One of the things Elise wanted to see was Bergen-Belsen, which is where my mother had been liberated from. So Ulrika called Bergen-Belsen and said, I have these 2 young people from the United States who are going to be here next week, because this was all pretty quick. We're going to be here next week, and they'd like to make arrangements to tour Bergen-Belsen. And the guy on the phone was like, you should have called us 6 months ago. And she's like, well, we didn't know them 6 months ago. And she really wants to see it. That's where her grandmother was liberated from. The guy said, should have started with that. What day do they want to come? What time are they going to be here? Elise and Corey had a full access, 100% access to all the grounds, all the records, all the buildings, with a private docent. So if you plan on going to Europe, if you have a connection like that, if one of your relatives was in one of the camps or liberated from one of the camps, they will take care of you when you go to see that space. These people, it was amazing. They raised over 5,000 euro for our trip. And none of these people have any dog in the fight, so to speak. There's almost nobody who was alive during World War II that was there. We were met by like 30 people in dismal weather, and they all just wanted to meet us and support us and take us around. And so the first day we were in Lehman. This is all of us with Ulrika and Christoph. This is the city of Koblenz, where the Feiners were from. It's called the Deutsche Eck, the German corner. It's where the Moselle and Rhine rivers meet. It's a very important location in Germany, because 2 major rivers and a lot is going on there. This is the Jewish cemetery in Koblenz. It had been essentially destroyed during the war. So while there are gravestones standing, they don't necessarily relate to actual graves. And you can see now the grass behind those gravestones is higher up than the walkway. Well, what happened was they actually have dug down. It's an old cemetery. When I say old, I mean some of the graves are from the 1300s. So they actually had to double up. So because they couldn't get any more space from the city to move it out, they had to just double it up. So in the late 50s, early 60s, a friend of our family and several of his friends who were also from that area joined a group. So that wall is actually gravestones that had been found in various places, either overturned or in other buildings. So during the war, when they needed stone for rebuilding buildings or paving a road, they would take headstones from Jewish cemeteries and use those to help pave the road. So they got a bunch of those back and they used it to build the wall to support the thing. So once again, those are all gravestones that had at one time been in the cemetery, but there's no relation to where there are bodies actually. This is a memorial to the population that was lost in the war, that was murdered during the war from Koblenz. And actually they had representatives of the local government there and two police officers who laid a wreath while we were there. So what that says, basically, rough translation, is this memorial is for our neighbors who perished in the war, who were killed in the war. In Germany, no official document or anything referring to World War II will say that people died in the concentration camps or died during the war. It always says they were murdered. Germany officially has bought it. You know, they own it. Unlike some countries where you're not allowed to talk about actual complicity during the war, in Germany it's against the law to deny the Holocaust, and anything that is official says killed or murdered. It never says died. And that says of the 500 or so Jewish residents of Koblenz at the start of the war, only 22 survived. And actually, that was based on the size of Koblenz then. If you take the current size of Koblenz, the number of Jews that lived in that area was around 750, but still only 22 were the number who survived. This is a church that's built in the 12th century. It's right down the street from the cemetery. And it was the deportation site for the Jews living in the Rheinpfalz. Rheinpfalz is it's like the county. So the people that lived in that area in the 30s and 40s, this church was the deportation site. So people were told, go to this church, meet there, and then they would get on trains. Train station was close by. And it's Mother Mary. Basically, it's the Church of Mother Mary or something like that. This is not a great picture, but to the left side, that's a gravestone that was found in the wall of the church when they were doing renovations after the war. They found this gravestone had been taken from the cemetery and used to patch a section of the interior wall. And you can see that it's Hannah, the daughter of Ephraim, died in Tammuz, no year, but it was 13 something, so 14th century. So that's how long the Jews have been living in Koblenz. This is Oberwesel, where my father's family was from. It's about 20 miles up the Rhine. Now, both my mother's family and my father's family were very well established in their towns. Both of my grandfathers were decorated war heroes from World War One, which is one of the reasons they both stayed in Germany, because they were like, nah, don't worry, nothing's going to happen. What are they going to do? First of all, I own this town. Second of all, I've got two Iron Crosses from World War, from the Great War. I've got two. I'm a son of the, a son of the fatherland, and what are they going to do to me? So that was why they stayed. So this is the site of the last synagogue in Oberwesel, which was built next to the Lichtenstein house. And what it says was, it was built in 1886. It was destroyed in 1938 on Kristallnacht. It was rebuilt in 1956. And with thanks to our Jewish neighbors. The building to the right with the white, that's where the synagogue had been. The building right next to that is now an office building, and that's what had been the Lichtenstein house. It's since been, well, the front has been totally redone. If you look at it from the back, it still looks very different. So to the right of that, you see a wall. So that wall is actually a Roman wall. It's over 2,000 years old. It was very interesting because we walked up on that wall, and it was like going back in time. It's like, so my father and his brother and their friends used to play on probably army on this wall, when they were kids. They used to climb all over this thing. And once again, there's the thing about beautiful country people, man. There's a church about a block down, and you get to the side of the church, you climb up on the wall, and there's steps. I mean, that's climbing up on the wall is nothing weird. That's a walkway. But if you climb up, and up on the wall of the church, there's this big space, probably about the size of one of these tables. And it's just in the wall, but it's hollow. There's nothing there. And you say, what was there? And they said, oh, they moved that to another church because it was a scene of blood libel. It showed two very stereotypical Jews and a small child hanging from a tree. So the Jews were hanging the child to get blood to make matzah for Pesach. And that was that was this big bas relief on the side of the church. Like, okay. So around the corner from the house, rather, was what was called the Schwan Hotel. It had been a hotel and then a dance club in the 1920s. And that's where everybody from Oberwesel and the surrounding area was told they had to leave their houses, and they were told, go to the Schwan Hotel. They went to the Schwan Hotel, and it had been run down. It hadn't been used in 20 years or 10 years, whatever. It was in total disrepair, and there were 50 or 100 people who were staying there. And one day, somebody came, we don't know who it was, but somebody came to the house and said, hey, Lichtenstein, take your family, go back home. And he did. Now, my grandfather, Lichtenstein, was head of the Veterans Association for the Rheinpfalz. So he had, we don't know if it was one of those connections or if somebody was paid or just somebody liked him, but he was told to go back home. So he went back to their house, and shortly thereafter, everybody at the Schwan Hotel was transported out. Nobody that was at the Schwan Hotel survived. This is called a Stolperstein. It translates to stumbling stone. This started out as an art project. And what it is, can you go backward? That guy, Gunter Denning, is putting in, oh, that's the first time I noticed that. That's my birthday. he's putting in a Stoppelstein. And what it is in front of the houses where the Jewish people lived, there's a stone that says, here lived Theodor Lichtenstein, born 1888, deported 1942 to Theresienstadt, 1944 in Auschwitz, murdered. And there's thousands of these, not nearly as many as the number of people who are gone, but there's probably about 15,000 of them now. This is a memorial to the Jews from Oberwesel that were deported or killed in the Holocaust. This is right across the street from the Lichtenstein house. And also, the Lichtenstein house, so the building to the left that you can't see, was actually like town hall. And in the basement of the town hall is where the Gestapo headquarters was for the Rheinfelds, for that area, right across the street. So that's a memorial to the Jews from Oberwesel. That's my sister and I. And this is a list of all the Jews from that area and who were deported or killed, and pointing to my family. And on the back, it says, Die Nacht endet und ein neuer Tag beginnt, wenn du das Gesicht deines Bruders erkannst. And that's a line from the Talmud. And it says, the night ends and a new day begins when you recognize your brother's face. That's a memorial to the Jewish in Oberwesel. This is Koblengarndorf. These towns are so small that about 50 years ago, Coburn and Gondorf, the two towns, combined to make one because they couldn't support anything by themselves. Again, the Moselle River, 3 streets, mountains, and this has castles. This is the Jewish cemetery of Coburn. Again, about 40 years ago, or 40, 50 years ago, they went around and put up the gravestones that they could find. They have no relation to where any actual graves are. This is the synagogue in Coburn, built in 1879. As it says, Jews lived in Coburn since 1563, and the last 13 were deported in 1942. Of those, 2 survived, my mother and her brother. This was the Wolf family house. So when my mother grew, it's now a 2-family. It's owned by the people that my mother and uncle sold it to in 1950 something. They rent it out. It's 2 apartments, but there's a barn and some amazing side building. Everything is very much. We actually got a chance to go into the house, which was just amazing. So you can see the house to the left and the barn in the back. The house is divided into two apartments now, whereas when my mother was growing up, it was she and her 3 siblings and her parents and live-in help. And he was the kosher butcher. On the first floor of the house is a room that is very odd. It's got hooks in the ceiling. To one side is a window in the wall, which was where he could sell meat out of that room. But next to that was a room about the size of a single-car garage with 2 troughs in the floor and hooks in the ceiling. And that's where he did the slaughtering. And then the barn had a half dozen pens for animals. And the barn had never been touched. It still had and the room that had been the slaughter room was nobody ever, I don't think anybody's gone in that room in 50, 60 years. It was amazing. It was just walking into the past. These are the Stoppelstein in front of the Wolf family home. My mother's on the left, and it says, Irene Wolf, born 1921, relocated to Cologne, deported in 1943 to Theresienstadt, then Auschwitz, and then Bergen-Belsen, where she was liberated from. Karl Heinz, next to her, that was her older brother, born 1921. He flücht USA, so he made it out to the United States in 1937. So in 1937, what happened was there was one branch of the family that had been in the States for several years, well, many years, in Philadelphia. And they sent a letter of sponsorship, thank you, a letter of sponsorship to all the families that were left in Germany. And each letter of sponsorship got you one person. So they sent the oldest male child. Who are you going to send? So that was Karl Heinz, my Uncle Karl. So it was it was at this point that my sister and I had like this like major revelation about our life growing up, because we never understood. We had this Uncle Karl who lived in South Jersey. We lived in North Jersey, but you figure can't be that big a difference. It's all New Jersey. But we were like such immigrant kids. We really were immigrant kids. And his kids were like so American. And it didn't make any sense and we just never understood it. It just never made any sense. And then we were talking to people when we were in Coburn, and they were like, well, you know, your Uncle Karl, he came back numerous times with his kids, but your mother never came back except that one time when they sold the house. And it was like, so Uncle Karl, he didn't go through the war. He left in 1937. He still had friends that he grew up with that weren't Nazis yet when he left. And then he came to the United States. He was 16. He finished high school here. He joined the American Army, fought in World War II in the American Army, came back to the States, went to college, and raised a family. I mean, he was American. My parents went through the war, went through the camps, came to the States in 1947, you know, in their late 20s, and they were not American. They were immigrants. And that was when we first realized that. This was the Wolf House in Coburn, and we put the outside candles on the Stolperstein. So in order to do that, in order to have the Stolperstein installed, you need the permission of the people who own the property. And not everybody gives that permission. So these people did. This was the Wolf family in 1937. My mother, her two younger brothers, and Karl Heinz on the side. This was Theo and his friends, Hauswolf and Ali Anheimer. We almost met Ali. Actually, Hans and Ali were people we almost met, but it was lousy weather. They were in their 90s. They were not well. And we were supposed to meet Hans, but he got sick when we were supposed to meet him, and he just was not coming out. Cologne is the nearest big city, and that's where my parents met. This is the site of the former Jewish hospital in Cologne, and this is where my mother met my father. So my father, when they couldn't go to school anymore, my mother was home, and after Kristallnacht, somebody said to my mother, send your daughter to the Jewish hospital in Cologne, and they'll train her to be a nurse. And so after Kristallnacht, my mother, who was 17, went to Cologne and lived in the Jewish hospital was like a complex. It was all separated from everything else, gated. And so she lived in the hospital and became a student nurse. When my father and his brother could no longer go to school, they went to, I believe, Frankfurt, where they were sponsored by ART, which is still around, the Organization for Rehabilitation Through Training. And they were learning mechanical somethings. And when that program was finally shut down, my father and his brother also were sent to the Jewish hospital in Cologne, where they became maintenance staff, facility staff. So that's where my mother, the 18-year-old student nurse, and my father, the 18-year-old facilities guy, janitor, basically, more than that, but more plumber than janitor. But that's where they met. It's now a senior center and a Jewish home, Jewish nursing home. That's the chapel in what was the hospital. That's the interior wall of the Jewish center, which is now, it was the exterior wall of the hospital. This is the Kölner Dome, the Cologne Cathedral. This is like a massive Gothic, just unbelievable, huge cathedral. And you can see it from like anywhere in Cologne and surrounding. The Germans said that it was shielded by the hand of God during World War II, because the Kölner Dome was never bombed. It was never hit. It was never anything. It was just, it made it through the war, maybe some collateral damage, but essentially untouched. So they always felt that it had the hand of God over it. In reality, it was the sighting spot. You could see these spires from 100 miles away, and that's what the bombers used to sight everything else that they were going for. So they never hit the cathedral, because that was their basis point to go to all the factories. And it's really just an amazing, it's a church, but it is amazing. And it's got these huge crypts from the 1200s and 1300s. This is LD House, once the Gestapo headquarters in Cologne, and now it's the National Socialist Documentation Center. These were my mother's working papers. They had amazing paperwork, stuff we'd never seen or considered. One of the things they had was a picture. This is my mother's testimony from 70 years ago it's all in German, but hand typed. And that was the testimony she sent of her experience. This is the Castle Wanderleyen in Kobern-Gondorf. This is where the actual transfer of the dishes took place on what would have been my mother's 100th birthday. This castle has two parts. They call it New Castle and Old Castle. The New Castle was built in 1200. This is the transfer night. That's Elise and Christoph, and that's the china. And they called them the good dishes. So I realized I didn't talk enough about the dishes. How Ulrika got them was when my great uncle and his wife were about to be relocated. Their daughter's best friend was the Marx's daughter. So they went to the Marxes and said, do us a favor, take our china and just hold it until we come back. Because everybody figured this can't last forever. So they gave it to them. Nobody ever came back. They had the china after, and that was at great peril, because if anybody knew they were keeping goods for a Jewish family through the war, they also would have been shipped out. So that was at great personal peril. When they had the, after the war, they kept the dishes, never used the dishes, just kept them on display. These are the Feiner's dishes. And then it went from them to their oldest daughter, Ulrika's older sister, and she had it for a couple of decades. And then Ulrika had it. She was the younger daughter. She got the dishes after her older daughter or her older sister, and she had them for, I think, 13 or 15 years, in that range. And again, they always kept them. They never used them. They always looked for Feiners, but they were like, we have to, I mean, they were good Germans. We have to find the people who own them. We can't use the dishes. They're not our dishes. You know, they could have sold them. These dishes were the finest china made in the 1920s when they were purchased. They're gold inlay with cobalt and gold trim. They're very expensive. And she kept the dishes. And when the story came out and Upper House saw the story, he was like, I can find them. Took him 3 days, you know, because he knew, well, he had a foot up. He knew the name Feiner from his genealogy in Koblenz, and he knew how to do genealogical research on the web. So, and this is the Last Supper. This was everybody that was involved, and that was the last night in Germany. It was amazing. These people who we had no idea who they were in June of 2021. In November of 21, these people were family. Christoph and his wife and daughter, and Ulrika, came to our daughter's wedding in March of that year. So, okay, I have to take water for this. So, at the transfer of the dishes, that was, like I said, in the castle. That was TV crews, news, interviews, maybe 75 people, none of whom we knew, who just wanted to know the story. And a Chabad rabbi from Koblenz, and we sang Shechionu, all of us. It was very interesting. And so Elise calls me up one day and she goes, so I have her, so the dishes were being held in a china shop in Germany, and they were going to ship them to us after the Christmas rush, when the words fragile, handle with care might mean something. And so it was end of November, beginning of December, and Elise calls me up and she goes, so I want to email Ulrika's older daughter. And we felt like we were stealing the china from them, because they were in their 20s and they're going, who gets the china next? You know, and it's like, and we took it. So Elise calls me up. She goes, I want to give one of the platters to Ulrika for Christmas without them knowing. So I said, fine, email her daughter. So the daughter went to the china shop, picked up the one of the platters, and on Christmas morning, Ulrika got to actually have her platter as her own. So they have one of the pieces, and we have those. My sister has Elise has the large covered casserole, and my sister has a piece. My nieces and nephews each have a piece, and that's the story of the china. But we think there were no cups and saucers because these were Fleischig, so they wouldn't have had coffee cups. So
That was amazing.
thank you very much.
Thank you. Will you take some questions?
Sure.
Thank you. It was moving. to say the least. It's not really a question so much as a comment. When I went to Germany or Europe after college, and frankly, we were there separately, but at the same time. But in any event, the point that my wife reminded me of is when we were there, you couldn't find anywhere. If you asked where is Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen, what? We don't know. We don't even know what you're talking about. So it's interesting to see and nice to see how the change has occurred.
I went to Germany the first time right after college, 1976, and it was a very different experience. First of all, I was in my early 20s. I had no idea of any of this. I did go to Dachau, which was the camp that they talked about that you could visit. This was 1976. I was walking around, and anybody who was 50 or older, I was going, oh, Nazi, Nazi, Nazi. So I had a very different experience in 1976 than the last time I went. But yeah, it's an amazing transformation of the country. And again, the people, they really were so the money that's left over from our trip, from the 5,000 euro that they raised, is going to build a memorial in Lehman to the Jews of that area.
Questions? Comments? Yes, you do. Otherwise, we won't hear it on the recording.
When you went there the first time, you spoke German,
Yeah.
but you have a very working knowledge of German.
I was in Europe for 6 weeks. By the time I got to Germany, I could always understand German because my parents spoke German when I was a little kid. Growing up, my parents spoke German, and my grandmother lived with us, so German was spoken in the house. So I had, it's like a lot of kids, understand Yiddish. Can't necessarily speak Yiddish, but they understand Yiddish. So we did not speak Yiddish in our house. My parents spoke Hochdeutsch, High German. Yiddish was not a thing. Yiddish was like street slang. But one of the things that did happen, and this happened both times I was in Europe, in 76 and the last time, is while my speaking German is essentially that of a 3-year-old, 5-year-old, as far as vocabulary and grammar, my accent is spot on because I don't have an American high school accent. I have a Rheinpfalz accent from my mother. So when I would speak in German, people would look at me and go, oh, gutes Kind, nice kid, thinking, what a moron. And then they'd ask, and where are you from? And I'd say, New York. And all of a sudden, I wasn't the moron. I was the American that spoke better German than anybody they had ever met in their life. And it was like everything immediately changed. So that was, yeah.
Barry, do you have a relationship with any of the cousins that were left, the 22 people that were left, that were not taken during the war?
No, the 22 people like in Koblenz, that's in the entire city of Koblenz. Those were not relatives.
So
Those
how
were
many
just-
relatives did you have left? Your family?
It was my father and his brother and sister and mother and grandfather. They came as a unit. And his cousin, my Uncle Herbert, and that was the Lichtenstein. And then there was like a couple of aunts. But, we used to joke, you could have our family reunion in a phone booth. There was the Lichtenstein family, everybody that made it here, the extended family was 12. The Wolf family was my mother and her brother, and that was it. So there were no other. I do have, so my father's brother has since passed away, as has his son, and his sister, my father's sister, who passed away when I was quite little. Her daughter actually lives in Albany, and we see her regularly. But I had no relationship with that. That was a whole nother mess that I had no relationship with them growing up.
Segueing on what Barry said about speaking German, everybody who's, and ever asked us, do you speak Yiddish? And I said, no, because my parents spoke German in the home. And I studied in Heidelberg for a year, and my father said they came over to visit, and we went to Hessen, where they were born, to visit in the town that they lived in when they came to visit us. And he said, we're going to a place that you won't understand their dialect. I said, Dad, I grew up with Hessische Deutsch my whole life, and I did understand. And I want to tell you a funny story about Barry in high school when we studied German in school. You know this story. We were learning the word for vegetables. And Hochdeutsch is Gemüse with the umlaut over the U. Barry raises his hand and said, you're wrong. Now he's telling the teacher she's wrong.
Fleisch is the best of
And
Gemüse.
Miss Getz, you said you're wrong.
Fleisch is the best
And he
of
raised
Gemüse.
his hand and he said, my Oma says Gemies. Well, that's how you say it in Koblenzer Deutsch. Gemies.
Oh.
So it was difficult. It was hard for us when we were learning the dialect German at home and then the Hochdeutsch in German. I also studied for a year in Heidelberg, and everyone said, oh, you're going to have such difficulty and you're going to meet up with. There was nothing. Heidelberg was a university city, and there was basically no anti-Semitism. And that was right after the Munich massacre of the Olympic team in 1972. And I felt that I needed to go back there and visit my heritage. I had never been there before. So I spent a whole year there. I visited uncles in Holland. I visited an uncle in Strasbourg, France. My uncle in Holland said to me in German, most students study and travel once in a while. You're traveling and you're studying once in a while. I said, I'm only here for 10 months. I need to see as much as I can. But I also have to tell you that I know a lot of the people that Barry has spoken about tonight, and it takes me back many, many years. And I listened to some of those stories, and I knew his Uncle Carl, and I knew his Aunt Ruth, and Uncle Gary from California. So this was very touching and just amazing. Just amazing.
So I can tell you.
Thank you, Sue, for bringing this
You have-
story to us. We really
Is
appreciate
there more
it.
time?
Questions on the chat. So Kathy wrote, do you continue to have regular contact with families in Germany or any plans to see them either in Germany or the US?
I'm in regular contact with Ulrike and Christoph. Ulrike is expecting to get access to this recording. We've already discussed that.
And we hear from Bruno too.
What's that?
And we hear from Bruno as well.
Yeah, we see them Facebook. I mean, you keep in touch with people. So there's interesting, anybody that's a Holocaust survivor family will have weird stories. So one of the weirdest from our family, it's going back a while, when my stepfather, so my father passed away when I was 7, my mother remarried when I was 10. So Otto came to the States in the early 30s, but also lost most of his family in the war. And when my mother was a student nurse in Cologne, after they were not doing a lot of like surgeries and things like that in the hospital anymore. One of the things that the doctor did was he would send out the student nurses to the train station in Cologne, and the people standing in line for relocation, they would offer them beverages, either tea and coffee in the winter and water in the summer. And my mother used to do it. So when Otto was turning 90, my mother said, "Oh, I have the greatest thing to do. I will take Otto's shoebox of pictures that he has," which was like all the pictures that he had from his life, "and I'll put some in an album for him for his 90th birthday." Great. So she's going through this shoebox of pictures and comes across this photograph of these three people. It's two women and a man, and they're very well dressed, and they're sitting for a photographer, and they're having their picture taken in their Sunday best. And my mother takes the picture, and she walks over to Otto, and she goes, "Otto, I know these people." And he goes, "Well, what do you mean you know these people? You can't know these people." She goes, "Sure, that's Shoshana, and I forget the other names, but she said the names of the three people." And he goes, "How do you know them?" She goes, "Oh, when I was a student nurse giving coffee at the train station in Cologne, these people came and I gave them coffee, and they said, 'Oh, thank you very much. That's very nice. What's your name?' And I said, 'Irene Wolf.' And the guy said, 'Oh, that's funny. Our name is Wolf also. I'm Joseph, and these are my two sisters, Shoshana and that was Otto's. My mother was Wolf 2Fs. Otto was Wolf 1F. But those people were Otto's mother and her brother and sister. And that was the day they were deported because they were told, go to Cologne to get the train, take what you can carry. So what people did was they wore their best stuff and then put everything else they could carry because they were being relocated. So what do you do? So my mother saw them. She didn't have to like extrapolate 50 years later or 70 years later that these people were, she saw the people in the picture probably a couple of days after they had had that picture taken, wearing the same clothes that they were wearing in that picture. So that's how she's like, "Oh yeah, I know them. I met them." But it was Otto's family.
The impetus for all this, I'm trying to understand because I'm not terribly bright. You started with, did the story start off because someone called you about the China, and then once you got there, it shifted to everybody else?
Once we got there, it became a story. It became a discovery of family and history and everything that went on. The background is really the Marxes who had this China and kept it for 80 years.
Which you didn't know about ahead of time.
We didn't know that those Feiners existed. My mother never mentioned anybody except the only Feiners we ever heard were my mother, Carolina Feiner.
So is it safe to say that your focus on this whole trip changed once you got there, or?
The day we walked in, the morning we arrived, everything was like,
changed.
"Oh my God."
Yeah.
And the people were like, "Is there anything we can do for you? What would you like to see? Where would you like to go? What can we do for you?"
And obviously the value of the China must have been great when it was a whole set. And that obviously doesn't mean anything to you more.
We have no
what
idea
it stands for.
We have no idea. This was after Kristallnacht, so it's possible that there may have been twice the number of pieces in 1938. But in 1942, when the Marxes got this is all that was left. When we had it appraised to have it, you have to have it appraised for insurance to ship it. The bowl is $100. Yeah. So, yeah, it's, $10,000 worth of China now. This is my wife. This is Esther. She was there too.
every day in every event that we went to, and the weather was horrific. It was cold. It was raw.
November.
It was November and the weather was terrible. And every place that they took us to, there were 30 or 40 people waiting for us to meet us because the town of Lehman did this whole thing about this family coming from America and the 80-year story of the dishes.
Barry, I don't have a question. I just wanted to thank you for sharing this wonderful story with us. It's an amazing story. So just thank you. And
Thank you.
thank you, Ellie, for bringing it to us.
Excellent job, Barry.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. The 80-year-old China.
Yep.
Fascinating.
The good dishes.
And the implications and the ripples that go out from all of that are all the kinds of stories we want to tell. So thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. Come back for our next presentation. We'll let you know when it is. It's in, I think, January or maybe December. I don't have the date on the top of my head, but enjoy. Thank you so much for being part of this wonderful presentation.
Night